The famous musician walked through the quiet streets of the small town, away from the bright lights and loud applause she was used to. The town was simple, peaceful, and a little old-fashioned. There were small shops, a few cafes, and people walking slowly, as if they had all the time in the world. She liked this kind of place because it gave her a chance to breathe. Fame could be suffocating, and here she could just be a person. It's not a celebrity. As she walked, she noticed a small cafe tucked into the corner of a street. It looked inviting, with warm lights spilling from the windows and a few people sitting outside, enjoying the late afternoon sun. She decided to go inside. The door jingled softly as she opened it, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods reached her immediately. There was a soft hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and somewhere in the background, the faint sound of a piano. She looked around the cafe. It was cozy, with wooden tables and chairs and walls decorated with paintings and photographs. In one corner, she saw a piano. It was an older, upright piano, slightly worn, with scratches on the wood and a few keys that were chipped. It did not look like an instrument anyone would notice in a city concert hall, but somehow it seemed to have a presence. She was drawn to it. There was a young woman sitting nearby. She was quiet, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes kept glancing at the piano. She was not dressed in anything flashy, just simple clothes, but there was something calm and composed about her. She looked like someone who belonged to the space around her, someone who did not feel the need to announce her presence, but was still there. Quietly noticed, the famous musician smiled at the young woman. She felt a small connection, a quiet understanding that they were both lovers of music in different ways. She moved closer to the piano, curiosity pulling her forward. She had played many pianos in her life, from grand concert halls to small hotel lounges. But there was something about this one that made her stop and pay attention. The young woman looked at her, slightly surprised, but she did not move away. It was as if she was waiting for something to happen. The famous musician could feel the quiet tension in the air, a gentle anticipation that made the moment feel important. She did not say anything, just watched as the young woman slowly reached for the keys. At first, the notes were soft, tentative, almost hesitant. They were not perfect, and the piano itself seemed to protest under her fingers. But there was something in the sound that caught the musician's attention. There was care in every note, a subtle emotion that spoke even without being loud or flashy. It was not about technique at first. It was about feeling. The famous musician leaned against the piano slightly, listening more closely. She was used to being the one who played, the one whose music people waited for. But this time she was a listener, completely absorbed in the unexpected. She noticed how the young woman's hands moved. Small movements that seemed deliberate yet natural, as if she had learned to play this way in secret. Away from any audience, people in the cafe were starting to notice too. Conversations became softer, and some stopped completely. The music was filling the space, not in a loud or overpowering way, but with a quiet strength that made everyone pay attention. Even the barista paused in the middle of making a coffee, listening without realizing it. The famous musician felt her smile fade into curiosity. She had expected to find ordinary notes, maybe a simple tune, but what she was hearing was different. There was a story in the way the young woman played, a depth that was unusual for someone so unassuming. Each note seemed to carry a small piece of her life, her struggles, her joys, and her dreams. It was not something that could be learned from lessons alone. It was something that had to be felt deeply. She watched the young woman closely. There was a gentle focus in her eyes, a calm determination. She was not performing for anyone, not trying to impress, not trying to compete. She was playing because she had to, because it was a part of who she was. That was what made it so compelling. The famous musician had played for thousands, but rarely had she seen someone play so purely for themselves. The cafe seemed to hold its breath. The soft hum of the coffee machine, the clinking of cups, and the low conversations all faded into the background. There was only the music and the quiet presence of the two women in the corner. The famous musician felt a strange mix of admiration and disbelief. She could not imagine how someone could have such skill and such depth hidden, away in a life that seemed so ordinary, as the young woman continued. The music began to take shape, forming a melody that was both familiar and new. It was gentle, yet it carried emotion that was raw and unfiltered. The musician could feel herself being pulled into it, not as a performer, judging another performer, but as a human being, moved by something real. It was a rare experience, one that did not happen often in her life of fame and carefully curated performances. The young woman's hands moved with confidence now, each note placed with care, each chord resonating with meaning. She closed her eyes for a moment, lost in the sound she was creating. The famous musician could see the small details, the way her fingers curved, the slight shift in her posture as she reached for a higher key, the way she paused slightly before a difficult transition. It was not just technical skill. It was intuition and feeling combined. People in the cafe began to lean in slightly, drawn by the music they could not fully understand but felt deeply. It was the kind of playing that made people stop and listen without realizing it. It was the kind of music that made time feel slower, as if the world outside the cafe had paused to give space for something important. The famous musician felt a lump in her throat. A rare reaction for someone who had heard and played music for decades. She realized something else too. This was not about competition or fame. The young woman was not trying to be better than anyone, not trying to prove herself. She was simply playing, letting the music flow through her. That authenticity was what made it extraordinary. The famous musician had performed countless times for audiences that applauded skill, technique, and presentation. Here, applause was unnecessary, and the music was more powerful because of it. The moment stretched on, each note building on the previous one, weaving a quiet, emotional tapestry. The musician felt her own mind clear of the usual distractions, her ego fading into the background. She was witnessing something rare, something that reminded her why she loved music in the first place. It was not about recognition, awards, or applause. It was about connection, about expressing what could not be said in words, but sharing a piece of the soul. The young woman's expression changed slightly. There was a small smile, a hint of joy in her eyes, as if she had forgotten the presence of the famous musician and the others in the cafe. She was completely absorbed in the music, lost in the sound she was creating. It was a beautiful human moment, pure and unpretentious. The famous musician felt a deep respect for this quiet, unassuming talent. She realized that greatness could exist anywhere, hidden in plain sight, often unnoticed by the world. It did not need a stage or an audience to be powerful. The young woman had found her own way to express herself. In doing so, she had captured the attention of someone who had seen it all. That was no small feat. As the final notes faded into the air, the cafe remained silent for a moment. No one moved, no one spoke. The music had left an impression, a quiet echo that lingered long after the last key was struck. The famous musician looked at the young woman, who opened her eyes slowly, as if coming back from a dream. There was a softness in her gaze, a humility that was rare and genuine. The famous musician smiled again, this time with a sense of wonder rather than casual amusement. She knew that this was just the beginning of something remarkable. In that simple, quiet cafe, far from the world of fame and flashing cameras, a moment had occurred that would stay with her for a long time. The young woman had played, and in doing so had shared something real, something human, something unforgettable. The young woman paused for a moment, her hands hovering above the piano keys. There was a brief silence, filled only with the soft hum of the cafe and the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. She looked around, noticing that the few people sitting nearby had stopped their conversations, leaning in slightly as if drawn by an invisible thread. Even the barista behind the counter had paused, eyes focused on the corner where she sat. The famous musician watched quietly, her initial smile replaced with curiosity. She had been expecting simple, timid notes, nothing that would hold her attention for long. But now, with this quiet anticipation, she realized she was about to witness something special. The young woman pressed her fingers down gently, letting the first note ring out slowly. It was soft, almost fragile, but it held a kind of clarity that immediately set it apart from ordinary playing. She seemed to play with a sense of purpose, each note deliberate. as if she was speaking in a language that only music could express. The sound was clean, precise, and yet it carried an emotional weight that was unexpected for someone so unassuming. The famous musician felt herself lean in slightly, drawn closer by the quiet power of the music. At first, the melody was simple, almost hesitant, as if she were testing the waters. But the famous musician noticed a subtle confidence behind the softness. Each note seemed measured, not rushed, not careless. There was a story hidden in the simplicity, a depth that could not be learned from textbooks or lessons alone. The music flowed naturally, not forced, and it had a gentle rhythm that made it impossible to ignore. The famous musician found herself studying the young woman's hands, the slight tension in her fingers, the graceful movement that spoke of years of private practice. As the melody progressed, it began to build subtly. The soft, careful notes transformed into chords that carried more weight and emotion. Each chord seemed to tell a story, a fragment of an unspoken life, a struggle, or a triumph. The young woman's expression changed as she played. Her eyes were half closed, focused on the sound she was creating rather than the people around her. The famous musician felt a strange mix of admiration and disbelief. She had seen countless performers, but rarely had she encountered someone who played with such honesty and self-expression. It was not about impressing an audience. It was about sharing something real. People in the cafe started to react without realizing it. Conversations died down, heads turned, and the soft clatter of utensils faded into silence. The music seemed to create a bubble around the young woman. It's isolating her from the ordinary world outside and pulling everyone into her private story. The famous musician could feel her pulse quicken, not from competition or comparison, but from awe. This was the kind of talent that did not need lights, stages, or cameras. It demanded only attention, and it deserved it. The young woman continued to play, each note more confident than the last. There was a delicate balance in her movements, a combination of strength and gentleness. The piano responded to her touch as if it had been waiting for this moment, for her fingers to coax out the melody hidden in its worn keys. The famous musician was amazed at how much expression the young woman could create without force. There was a natural flow, an instinctive understanding of harmony and emotion. It was clear that the music came from a place deep inside her, a place that had seen both hardship and joy. As the music developed, it began to change in tone. The soft, tentative introduction grew into a melody that was more complex, more daring. There were small flourishes, intricate patterns that required both skill and imagination. The famous musician's eyes widened slightly. She recognized the techniques being used, the careful phrasing, the subtle shifts in tempo and emphasis. These were not beginner moves. They were the hallmarks of someone who had been playing in secret for years. Someone who had cultivated their talent quietly and passionately. The cafe remained hushed. Everyone caught in the spell of the music. Even those who had been talking moments before were now listening with rapt attention. The atmosphere shifted as if the piano had become the center of a world where nothing else mattered. The young woman was no longer just a person in a cafe. She had become a storyteller, and her medium was sound. Each note carried meaning, each chord resonated with unspoken emotion. The famous musician felt herself being drawn into the narrative. For a moment, the famous musician almost forgot where she was. She was used to commanding stages, hearing applause and performing under pressure. Here she was a listener, humbled and enthralled by raw, unpolished genius. She noticed how the young woman's fingers moved with both precision and freedom, a combination that only comes from years of personal dedication. It was clear that she had not learned to play to impress, but to express, and that made all the difference. The melody shifted again, introducing a minor key that added a layer of melancholy to the piece. The young woman's face reflected a hint of sadness, a memory or feeling that she poured into the music without words. The famous musician felt a pang of empathy, as if she could feel the story behind each note. It was the kind of music that lingered in the air long after the keys had been struck, leaving a quiet imprint on the hearts of those who listened. The cafe was completely silent now, as if the music had paused time itself as the young woman played. She began to experiment with dynamics, softly whispering some notes, and letting others roar with emotional intensity. She was not constrained by rules. She followed the music wherever it wanted to go. The famous musician marveled at the courage it took to be so honest in one's playing, especially when no one expected anything remarkable. It was a rare moment of authenticity, a reminder of why music had the power to move people so deeply. A small smile appeared on the young woman's face as she found a rhythm that resonated within her. She leaned slightly into the piano, eyes closed, completely absorbed. It was as if the music had become an extension of her being, a voice for feelings she had never been able to express. The famous musician felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of awe, respect, and emotion. She knew that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that could not be replicated or taught. Time seemed to stretch. Each note became more intentional, more expressive. The young woman's playing flowed naturally, each phrase building upon the last, forming a melody that was both intricate and heartfelt. The famous musician noticed the subtle changes in tempo, the slight pauses that added tension, and the delicate touch that gave certain notes a haunting quality. It was a masterful blend of technical skill and emotional depth, and yet it was entirely unassuming. The people in the cafe were captivated, drawn into the music even if they did not understand every technical detail. They could feel the emotion, the story, the heart behind the playing. The famous musician could see the impact in their eyes, the way they leaned forward slightly, listening more intently. It was a quiet connection, unspoken, yet profound. Music had a way of breaking down barriers, and in this small cafe, it had created a moment of unity and shared experience. As the piece continued, the young woman began to explore higher registers, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision and grace. The famous musician felt a sense of recognition, a knowledge of the skill required to play like that. Yet it was not mechanical or showy. Each movement felt intentional, as if every note had a purpose and a place in the larger story. The piano sang under her hands, the sound rich and layered, filling the room with a warmth that touched everyone present. The famous musician's admiration grew. She had played for audiences that cheered loudly, that rewarded technical brilliance and showmanship. But here, in this quiet cafe, she was witnessing a different kind of brilliance. One that came from sincerity, passion, and the quiet strength of a hidden talent. It was a reminder of what music truly was, beyond fame, beyond applause, beyond expectation. The young woman's expression changed subtly as she reached the middle of her piece. There was a small intensity in her eyes, focus that showed she was fully invested in the story she was telling through music. The famous musician noticed how her shoulders relaxed slightly, how her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of her playing. It was a human, organic performance, untouched by pressure or performance anxiety. It was pure, and that purity was what made it extraordinary. As the piece began to wind down, the young woman's fingers slowed, letting the last notes linger in the air. There was a gentle fade, a softness that left the room in a quiet, reflective state. The cafe remained still, everyone absorbing the final echoes. The famous musician sat back slightly, feeling a mixture of relief, admiration, and inspiration. She knew she had witnessed something rare, a glimpse of true talent and genuine artistry hidden away from the world. When the last note finally faded, the young woman opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. She looked around, noticing the quiet attention of the people in the cafe, and then finally met the eyes of the famous musician. There was no arrogance, no expectation, just a humble acknowledgement of the shared moment. The famous musician smiled, this time fully present, feeling both honored and deeply moved. She understood that this was just the beginning of a story, one that was unfolding in the most unexpected of places, and she could not wait to see where it would lead. The young woman's fingers hovered for a brief moment above the keys, as if listening to her own heartbeat before continuing. There was a quiet tension in the air, the kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. The cafe had fallen into a deep silence, everyone present drawn into the invisible web of her music. The famous musician sat closer now, leaning slightly forward, feeling a mix of curiosity admiration, and something more profound she could not quite name. This was not just talent. This was something extraordinary, something that seemed to rise naturally from the young woman's soul. When she pressed her fingers down again, the sound was different. It was stronger, bolder, yet carefully measured. Each note seemed to tell a story, a piece of her life, a fragment of her experiences. The famous musician's eyes widened slightly. She had expected skill, maybe a few moments of beauty, but what she was hearing was far beyond that. There was mastery in the simplicity, an elegance in the flow, and a depth that was rare to encounter, especially in someone so unassuming. The young woman's expression had changed. Her face, calm and composed before, now revealed subtle emotion. Her eyebrows curved slightly, her lips pressed together in concentration. She was lost in the music, but it was not a loss of control. It was a surrender, a merging of self and sound. The famous musician felt her chest tighten with admiration. She had performed in front of thousands, judged countless musicians. But she had rarely seen someone play with such authenticity and raw emotion. It was as if the piano had become an extension of the young woman herself. The melody began to shift, moving through unexpected changes in tempo and key. There were moments of tension followed by gentle resolution, each transition seamless and natural. The famous musician could see the skill behind each movement, the subtle use of dynamics, the thoughtful phrasing, yet it did not feel mechanical or rehearsed. It felt alive. It felt human. She realized that this was someone who had spent years practicing in private, learning not just the notes, but the feeling behind them. The stories that music could tell, the audience in the cafe was completely absorbed. Some had forgotten their drinks, their conversations, their phones. All that mattered was the music, the fragile yet powerful story being woven in the corner. The barista paused mid-pour, the sound of coffee dripping replaced by the echo of the piano. People glanced at each other quietly, sharing a sense of wonder that did not require words. The famous musician understood immediately why. Great music has a way of bypassing language, reaching straight to the heart. And that was exactly what was happening now. The young woman's playing became more complex. Her hands moved independently, yet in perfect harmony, creating layers of sound that seemed almost orchestral. She added small flourishes, delicate trills, and intricate arpeggios that made the famous musician's eyes widen in surprise. These were not the careless experiments of an amateur. These were deliberate, precise, and expressive, demonstrating technical mastery that belied the young woman's quiet appearance. It was impossible to ignore the skill, but it was the emotional honesty behind the skill that made it breathtaking. As the piece reached its middle, the young woman's music began to take on a narrative quality. There were ups and downs, moments of tension and release, passages that spoke of joy, sorrow, hope, and longing. The famous musician felt herself being carried along the current of the music, each note a step in a story she could feel but not fully understand. She realized that this was what made truly great musicians extraordinary, not just their technique, but their ability to communicate without words, to convey feelings so completely that the listener is drawn inside the music itself. The young woman's eyes remained closed, but her presence was commanding. She did not need to look at the audience or even the piano. It was as if the music existed within her, waiting to be released. The famous musician leaned in, trying to catch every detail, the way her fingers curved, the subtle shifts in pressure, the way she balanced strength and delicacy in perfect proportion. Every movement had purpose, every note had meaning, and the combination was mesmerizing as she played. There were moments when the young woman's music became almost conversational. One hand would pause, the other would answer. A gentle back and forth that sounded like a dialogue with herself, or perhaps with an invisible partner. The melody was layered, yet coherent, each phrase leading naturally to the next. It was clear that she was thinking deeply about every note, every pause, every dynamic shift. The famous musician felt a surge of respect. She knew how difficult it was to combine technical skill with expressive storytelling. And yet here it was, happening in a quiet corner of a small cafe. The audience's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. People shifted in their seats, leaned forward, and let their eyes soften. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Even those who had walked in with casual expectations found themselves captivated. The famous musician realized that she was witnessing not just a performance, but a connection between human beings through the medium of sound. There was something profoundly intimate about it, something that reminded her why she had devoted her life to music in the first place. The young woman's playing took on a darker tone, introducing minor chords that hinted at struggle and tension. The famous musician felt a chill, a recognition that this was not just technical skill, but the ability to convey complex emotion. The music was vulnerable, exposing feelings without words, and yet it was beautiful. There was bravery in that vulnerability, and it made the famous musician's admiration deepen. She had played on grand stages, but this was a level of honesty she had rarely encountered. Then, almost imperceptibly, the music began to rise. The notes grew more confident, more daring. The young woman added intricate runs and sudden shifts in dynamics that required incredible control and awareness. The famous musician's eyes widened as she recognized the difficulty of the passages. These were not tricks. These were choices, deliberate decisions that required skill and instinct in equal measure. Yet the young woman made it look effortless, as if the piano itself was an extension of her thoughts and emotions. The tension in the cafe was palpable. Each note carried weight. Each pause was meaningful. The famous musician could feel herself being drawn into the narrative, her own experiences and emotions reflected in the music. She noticed small details, the subtle rubato, the way certain chords were held slightly longer for emotional effect, the gentle crescendo that built without being forced. It was as if the young woman had discovered a secret language of sound, one that spoke directly to the heart. Time seemed to slow. The cafe faded into the background, leaving only the young woman, the piano, and the music. The famous musician felt her own emotions shifting in response to the performance. She felt awe, admiration, and a kind of humility she had not expected. It was a reminder that talent could exist anywhere, hidden, waiting for the right moment to be seen and heard. The young woman's mastery was not about recognition or fame, it was about connection, expression, and truth. As the music reached its climax, the young woman's playing became even more powerful. She used the full range of the piano, the deep bass notes resonating through the floor, the high notes sparkling above like light. The famous musician was completely captivated, unable to look away. She could see the concentration and joy on the young woman's face, and it made her heart swell with respect. This was not just a performance. It was a revelation. The young woman began to slow the pace, bringing the music toward a gentle conclusion. The final notes were soft, lingering in the air, leaving a quiet echo that seemed to fill the entire cafe. Everyone exhaled collectively, as if the music had held them in suspense and now allowed them to breathe. The famous musician felt a deep sense of gratitude, both for witnessing the performance and for being reminded of the beauty and power of authentic expression. When the last note faded, the young woman opened her eyes slowly. There was a calmness, a humility, and a quiet satisfaction in her gaze. She did not seem to notice the rapt attention she had drawn, the silence that had fallen over the cafe, or the subtle nod of respect from the famous musician. She simply allowed the moment to exist, serene and complete. The famous musician remained seated, processing what she had just witnessed. She realized that she had been frozen, not by surprise, but by awe. The young woman had played with skill, emotion, and honesty in a way that transcended ordinary music. It was a rare and humbling experience, one that would stay with her forever. In that small cafe, in that quiet corner, something extraordinary had occurred. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about human connection, about the power of music to communicate what words cannot, and about the hidden brilliance that exists in the most unexpected places. After the last note had faded, the young woman's hands rested lightly on the piano keys. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes slowly, as if emerging from a dream she had been living only in her own world. The cafe remained still for a few moments, the silence filled with awe and reflection. The famous musician looked at her closely, noticing the calmness in her face and the humility that accompanied such extraordinary talent. She realized that the young woman had not been playing for recognition or approval. She had been playing because it was essential to her being, part of her soul. The young woman finally looked around, her gaze landing on the famous musician. There was a quiet acknowledgement between them, a shared understanding that something remarkable had just occurred. The famous musician nodded slightly, her respect evident in her eyes. She had performed countless times in front of large audiences, but rarely had she felt so humbled, so deeply moved by another person's music. This was not about fame or technique. It was about heart, about honesty, and about the raw power of talent that had gone unnoticed. The cafe patrons began to return to their normal rhythms slowly. Some whispered to each other about what they had just heard, while others sat silently, still lost in the echoes of the performance. The young woman remained seated, hands still resting on the piano, as if she were savoring the final moments of her expression. The famous musician watched her, fascinated not only by her skill, but by the quiet strength she radiated. It was clear that her life had shaped this music, and that the piano had become a channel for feelings that might otherwise have remained hidden. The famous musician decided to speak, her voice gentle and sincere. "You're playing. It's incredible. Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. The young woman looked at her with a slight smile, a hint of shyness in her eyes. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how much to reveal, and then began to speak in a soft, calm voice. "I learned on my own," she said. "I didn't have lessons like most people think. I just listened, practiced, and played whenever I could. Music has always been a part of my life, even when other things were difficult." The famous musician leaned in slightly, sensing there was more to the story. "What kind of difficulties?" she asked gently. The young woman's gaze dropped to her hands again, and she took a moment before answering. "Life," she said simply. "Sometimes there wasn't enough money. Sometimes there wasn't support. I had to put my music aside for a while to help my family, to work, to survive. But I never stopped playing entirely. The piano, it's always been there for me, even when everything else felt impossible." The famous musician nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. She had encountered many prodigies in her career, but rarely had she met someone whose talent had been shaped so directly by life's challenges. There was resilience in the young woman's playing, a depth that came from experience, struggle, and quiet perseverance. Every note she had played had carried not only skill, but the echoes of a life lived fully. With its hardships and joys, the young woman continued, her voice growing a little stronger as she spoke about her journey. She described nights spent practicing in small, dimly lit rooms, sneaking in time whenever she could. She spoke of moments of doubt, of times when she thought her talent would remain hidden forever. And she spoke of the solace she found in music, the way it allowed her to express feelings she could not put into words. The famous musician listened intently. Moved by the honesty and courage in her story, it became clear that this young woman's music was more than just talent. It was survival, expression, and resilience all in one. She had not chosen the path of fame, nor had she sought recognition. She had played for herself, for the quiet moments when the world was still, for the small victories that no one else would see, and in doing so, she had developed a skill that was breathtaking, a voice that spoke directly to the hearts of those who listened. The famous musician felt a deep respect, realizing that the young woman's story gave her performance an entirely new dimension. It was not just about the music she had just played. It was about everything that had led her to this moment, the years of practice and obscurity, the sacrifices made, and the unwavering dedication to her craft. The piano had been both her companion and her confidant, a source of comfort and strength through life's challenges. As the young woman spoke, the famous musician noticed subtle details about her presence, the way she sat with quiet dignity, the calm confidence in her posture, the gentleness of her movements. It was evident that her life experiences had shaped not only her music, but also the person she had become. There was a quiet power in her humility, a reminder that true strength often resides in those who appear unassuming. The famous musician felt inspired, humbled, and profoundly moved all at once. The young woman's story continued, revealing moments of loss, moments of joy, and moments of discovery. She spoke of small triumphs, like mastering a difficult passage after weeks of practice, and of the private satisfaction that came from expressing herself honestly through music. She described how playing the piano had given her a sense of control when the world felt uncertain, a voice when words were inadequate, and a sense of purpose when life seemed aimless. The famous musician listened quietly, realizing that every note she had played in the cafe carried this story within it. And that was what made it so powerful. The cafe patrons, though quieter than before, had begun to feel the weight of the story behind the music. Some whispered to each other, others simply sat in reflective silence. The young woman's narrative added depth to what they had heard, transforming a beautiful performance into a profound human experience. The famous musician could see the impact, not just in herself, but in everyone around her. Music, she realized again, was not just sound. It was emotion, story, and connection. The famous musician finally spoke again, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "You have something rare," she said. "Not just talent, but heart, determination, and honesty. You've created music that touches people deeply, and you've done it all without seeking recognition. That's extraordinary." The young woman looked down, a faint blush on her cheeks. She shook her head slightly. "I never thought of it that way," she said. "I just wanted to play. I never expected anyone to notice, let alone someone like you." The famous musician smiled softly, understanding the humility and quiet strength behind her words. She had met countless musicians in her career, but few had moved her in the way this young woman had. It was not just the skill, not just the sound. It was the story, the perseverance, and the humanity behind the playing. She realized that the young woman's life experiences had given her a depth that could never be taught in a classroom or learned from a book. They spoke for a while longer, sharing thoughts about music, life, and the quiet power of dedication. The young woman spoke of her dreams, small as they were, and of the hope that someday, perhaps her music might reach others beyond the walls of her home or this small cafe. The famous musician encouraged her, sharing wisdom gained from years of performing and observing talent. She emphasized that true music comes from the heart and that the young woman had an abundance of it. The young woman's story left a lasting impression. It explained not just the beauty of her playing, but the profound connection it created with the audience. Each note, each phrase, each subtle pause had been informed by life, by struggle, and by resilience. The famous musician realized that this was what made the music unforgettable. It was not just the technical skill, it was the human story behind it. It's the life that had shaped the music into something extraordinary. As the afternoon wore on, as the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the young woman remained at the piano for a few moments longer, her hands resting lightly on the keys, savoring the experience. The famous musician watched her with a mixture of admiration and reflection. She had witnessed not only an incredible performance, but a life story expressed through music. It was a rare privilege, one that she knew would stay with her forever. Before leaving, the famous musician gently placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Never stop playing," she said softly. "The world needs to hear this, even if it doesn't know it yet." The young woman nodded, a quiet smile spreading across her face. There was gratitude in her eyes, not just for the words, but for the recognition and understanding of her journey. She had always played for herself, but now she realized that her music could touch others in ways she had never imagined. The cafe had witnessed more than just a performance. It had become a space where a hidden talent was revealed, where a life story was shared without words, and where human connection was strengthened through music. The famous musician left with a sense of awe and inspiration, deeply moved by the young woman's story and the power of music to convey emotion, resilience, and hope. The young woman returned to her quiet life, but with a newfound awareness of her gift and the encouraging realization that her music could reach beyond the confines of her own experience. The encounter had changed both of them. Leaving a lasting imprint that neither would forget, the famous musician stepped outside into the soft evening light, taking a deep breath as the sounds of the small town drifted around her. The experience in the cafe still echoed in her mind, each note of the young woman's music lingering like a memory she could not forget. She walked slowly down the quiet street, reflecting on what she had witnessed. Talent, she realized, was not always obvious, and greatness could exist far from the public eye, quietly shaping lives in ways most people would never see. Back in the cafe, the young woman sat with her hands folded on the piano. She had returned to the seat quietly, savoring the moment of calm after the performance. Though the famous musician had left the space physically, her presence lingered, as if the encounter itself had created a subtle energy that remained in the room. The young woman felt a mix of emotions: gratitude, humility, and a sense of possibility she had not known before. Her life had been one of quiet dedication, and yet in that small corner of the world, she had touched someone remarkable and shared a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long.